10. Sex and Religion. The association of sex and religion is a common one, and more than a few writers have attempted to trace all religions to phallic worship. The frequently close connection of sex and religion can be granted. Fertility cults are found in every part of the world, past and present. This relationship is in fact declared in Scripture to be an attribute of false religions. St. Paul declared of unregenerate men, "They claim to be wise, but they've become fools. They have exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the semblance and likeness of mortal man, of birds, of quadrupeds, and of reptiles. So God has given them up in their heart's lust to sexual vice, to the dishonoring of their own bodies, since they have exchanged the truth of God for an untruth, worshipping and serving the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." Romans chapter 1, verses 22 to 25. Moffat. As Murray noted of this text, religious degeneration is penalized by abandonment to immorality. Sin in the religious realm is punished by sin in the moral sphere. This is not only a natural law of consequences operative in sin, it is, moreover, the act of God. There is the positive infliction of handing over to that which is wholly alien to and subversive of the revealed good pleasure of God. God's displeasure is expressed in his abandonment of the persons concerned to more intensified and aggravated cultivation of the lusts of their own hearts, with the result that they reap for themselves a correspondingly greater toll of retributive vengeance. The relationship of sex and religion is thus a real one. It's an aspect of man's revolt from God. When man turns to self-worship, he ends by worshipping his own sexual vice. Refusing to acknowledge the power of God as Lord and Creator, he worships his own genital powers as Creator. An interesting example of this was cited by Herbert Asbury in his account of the Barbary Coast. After the San Francisco Peninsula earthquake of April the 18th, 1906, the reaction of countless men was to seek comfort in sex. In nearby Oaklands, also badly shaken, the police chief, Walter J. Peterson, stated of the houses of prostitution, "All day long and at night, men were lined up for blocks waiting in front of the houses, like at a box office at a theatre on a popular night." As an age approaches death, man's sexual activity becomes all the more intensely perverse because his religious hunger has increased, and sex is his substitute God. But this is not all. Man, at the same time, begins to justify his religious and moral depravity. The modern view of the orgy must at all costs be rejected. It assumes that those who took part had no sense of modesty at all, or very little. This superficial view implies that the men of ancient civilization had something of the animal in their nature. In some respects, it is true that these men do often seem nearer than ourselves to the animals, and it is maintained that some of them shared this feeling of kinship. But our judgments are linked to the idea that our peculiar modes of life best show up the difference between man and animals. Early men did not contrast themselves with animals in the same way, but even if they saw animals as brothers, the reactions on which their humanity was based was far from being less rigorous than ours. This is why, when we discuss the orgy in a very general way, we have no grounds for seeing it as an abandoned practice, but, on the contrary, we should regard it as a moment of heightened tension, disorderly, no doubt, but at the same time, a moment of religious fever. In the upside-down world of feast days, the orgy occurs at the instant when the truth of that world reveals its overwhelming force. Bacchic violence is a measure of incipient eroticism whose domain is originally that of religion. But the truth of the orgy has come down to us through the Christian world, in which standards have been overthrown once more. Primitive religious feeling drew from taboos the spirit of transgression. Christian religious feeling has, by and large, opposed the spirit of transgression. The tendency which enables a religious development to proceed within Christianity is connected with these relatively contradictory points of view. It is essential to decide what the effects of this contradiction have been. If Christianity had turned its back on the fundamental movements which give rise to the spirit of transgression, it would have lost its religious character entirely, in my opinion. By orgy, badai, of course, means the religious festivals of antiquity which called for the religious practice of acts of chaos, adultery, homosexuality, incest, bestiality, looting, burning, killing, and general depredation. This religious spirit of transgression is described by Bataille. But the most constant characteristic of the impulse I have called transgression is to make order out of what is essentially chaos. By introducing transcendence into an organized world, transgression becomes a principle of an organized disorder. For these cults of chaos, every act of man was holy and sacred, since man was in continuity with the divinity of being. But Christianity, according to Bataille, desacralizes man and the world. It reduced the sacred and the divine to a discontinuous and personal God, the Creator. As a result, there is a movement to restore love to its proper place in man's life, that is, a place of free expression. It is held that love opens up unlimited potentialities. According to Dr. Charles Francis Potter, life is the only marvel, only life is divine. That means that life and the sexuality of life is beyond law, because it is itself divine. Sex is then worshipped. Goldberg calls it the sacred fire. Of the worship of sex, he writes, "Still, sex worship did for man even more than that. It was the redeemer of his imprisoned soul. It provided an outlet for those sexual passions which the race had known in its infancy, but which later had apparently been driven out of heart and mind. Memories of them may have lingered on, as they had not been entirely effaced from the earth. At all events, the desire was there, smouldering beneath the heap of suppressions. Once, man was a free agent sexually. He could mate with any female that came his way. Now he was in chains. Sex worship came to break the fetters and, if only for a brief space of time, to bring back to man the freedom that had been his. What was forbidden at large in the bush not only was permitted, but, in fact, became a duty in the temple of the gods. When, in the temple, man was free to do as he pleased sexually, he pleased to do it with all the freedom possible. As a result, we have a studied religious assault on biblical moral law. First, relativism is demanded. We are told that everyone must be judged in terms of his own standards. According to Danielson, To accuse the Polynesians of being immoral according to our Christian Western standard is, of course, as unreasonable as it would be for them to condemn us because we do not observe Polynesian taboo rules. Elementary justice demands that we shall employ every people's own moral code as a standard in trying to judge their conduct. And if we make this our starting point and compare the Polynesians' manner of observing the existing canons of behaviour with our own moral standard, it is we who must be ashamed. Danielson appeals to elementary justice, but it is not a justice any Christian can recognize, because he has redefined justice and morality in humanistic, relativistic terms. Danielson not only proposes moral anarchism, but he denies to those who differ from him any right to disagree. His plea for tolerance is thus grounded in a radical intolerance. Second, these relativists then demand, to quote the wife of a former Belgian Minister of Justice, Madame Lillard, a radical humanism, a resacralization of human love. Not surprisingly, Madame Lillard grounds her thinking in the ancient chaos cults and the myth of the androgyne. She is not an advocate of license, but she is even less an advocate of law and duty, for duty is as surely desacralizing as is license. Her hope is in a free, spontaneous, sacred love which will not need the law. Must one conclude that freedom and fidelity are irreconcilable? No. On the contrary, though a forced and conventional fidelity may have its moral and social advantages, only a spontaneous and loving fidelity, constantly renewed by being chosen in complete freedom, can strengthen the couple in its supernatural vocation. A couple must at least speculate on, bet on its ability to last. It must have faith in its love, faith in its resistance to time. If, by ill fortune, the love is extinguished, no duty or forced fidelity can give it back its sacral quality. What can happen then is a series of mutual adjustments in an atmosphere of association, of companionship. But it will do no good to deceive oneself. These adjustments will merely sanction the couple's passage from sacral love to profane love. And this must be held to be a falling off. The absurdity of this position is that it wants the lawlessness of the humanist while retaining the faithfulness of the Christian. An impossible combination. But to return to the point made by Goldberg, namely that sex is a redeemer, this is increasingly an aspect of the modern scene. It is a serious error to see an era like the present, or the late Roman Empire, as a time of oversexed people. As a matter of fact, the times of intense sexuality are also commonly times of low sexual vitality. When Madame de Maneton was over 70, she complained because her husband, Louis XIV, insisted on his conjugal rights every day and sometimes twice. This is less likely to be a complaint in an age of decline. The end of an era sees a decline in every kind of energy, including sexual energy, and, as a result, normal sexual energy is replaced by a frenetic one. Extremes of provocation are resorted to because it takes more to stimulate a low and jaded appetite. It takes vastly more to excite a man in a declining era. Flagrant sexuality is thus a mark of low vitality. Perversion and violence are also required to stir the sick appetite. It becomes especially important to reject all that is normal, lawful, and a part of the ordered, godly, quote-unquote, past. to be influenced by anything other than the moment is held to be wrong. Thus, when Andrei Voznetsensky, a Soviet writer, was asked, "Which Russian poets of the last 40 years have influenced you the most?" he replied, "What a question! Being influenced by old poets is like being in love with your grandmother." In such a perspective, the rootless man is a redeemed man, and Hollow speaks of Henry Miller as on the mountaintop of the world, at the foot of the ladder to man's heaven. Righteousness has roots. It is grounded in God's law and moves in terms of redemptive history, past, present, and future. As a result, righteousness is the enemy for religious sexuality, whereas evil, being rootless and heedless, is pure and holy. A character of O'Donoghue declares, "Be not so naive as to believe that cruelty and violence must necessarily be motivated. The malicious act, set apart from the commonplace, lackluster treadmill of goal-oriented drives, attains a certain purity of its own being. Thus, it is evil, and especially evil and perverted sexuality, which, in this perspective, becomes redemptive." The 1968 to 1969 film, Diorama, is, we are told, a strange, enigmatic parable dealing with corrupt contemporary society through the devastating effects a mysterious, sensual stranger has on an industrialist's family. The film was labelled obscene by the Italian government. It is an Italian production, but the Catholic Church honoured it with a prize, which was later withdrawn. A mysterious stranger visits the household and gives every member of the household the kind of sexual solace for which each yearns. The stranger reads their innermost thoughts and comforts them. Involved are a father, mother, son, daughter, and maid. When the stranger leaves, a great void, an intellectual and spiritual abyss from which no help can come, exists. The father becomes a naked homosexual roaming the streets, the mother a moral tramp. The son seeks escape in impressionistic art. The daughter becomes demented, and the maid becomes a religious hermit who performs miracles. What meaning can be found in all this? Is the stranger supposed to be God, the devil, or neither one? Are these people so depraved that when their artificial bourgeois existence is stripped away, they have nothing left but madness? The fact that the mysterious stranger can be either God or the devil, or neither one, is especially telling. The point is that there is no discernible difference between God and the devil, so that such a mysterious stranger can be equally termed either or neither. Ultimacy and morality are held to be incompatible, and therefore, God or the devil must rob men of their artificial bourgeois existence in a world of good and evil. Thus, sex in Diorama is a double-edged religious instrument. It can bring redemption, or it can bring damnation to those who refuse its message. Similarly, the film I Am Curious, Yellow, a Swedish film, is characterized by a radical defiance of authority expressed sexually, according to sociologist-psychologist Dr. Charles Vinnick, a witness in favor of the film at its American trial. This states it clearly. The purpose of this religious sexuality is the defiance of authority, God's authority by the new God, man. This defiance requires the religious enactment of evil as a matter of principle. The test of excellence in leadership in some groups today is depravity. the performance of various perverted acts. Their thesis is the righteousness of Lucifer, that is, of evil. A love of filth, a belief in their divinity, and a total warfare against every law of God is their principle. All this should not surprise us. It is a law of being that religious apostasy has moral consequences. As St. Paul made clear in Romans chapter 1, the idolatry of man inescapably results in immorality, and immorality in perversity and perversions. Because such men forsake God, he forsakes them. Such men exchange the truth of God for a lie. Romans chapter 1, verse 25. By a lie is meant here false gods, who are the supreme embodiment of falsehood. Knox's comment on Romans chapter 1, verses 24 to 27 states in part, the apostle's primary purpose at the moment is to point not to sins, but to judgment. He sees in the moral corruption, especially in the unnatural sexual vices, a sign that the wrath has already begun to work. God gave them up to impurity. We have already seen that Paul conceived of sin and its consequences as being in the closest possible connection. Decay and death followed upon sin as inevitably as life and peace upon righteousness of faith, and indeed partook of the same character. So here he sees the prevalence of homosexuality, the dishonouring of their bodies among themselves, as a manifestation not only of sin, but also of its issue and punishment, that is, corruption and death. The humanist rebels against God in order to exalt himself. The grim irony of judgment is that his act leads to dishonouring himself. The humanist seeks to glorify and honour his body, but he instead dishonours it openly and makes his disgrace a public fact. Sex and religion are thus closely and inescapably linked in every non-biblical faith. It is the religious result of apostasy. Man worships his own sexual evil and exalts his disgrace into a way of life. Humanistic man worships the moments and converts the spirit of transgression into a religious principle. Such a faith cannot create or perpetuate a culture, it can only destroy it. Men must either rebuild in terms of the triune God, or be ploughed under by his judgment